Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander, and welcome to the Great War. By February 1920, the Bolsheviks had gained control over most of European Russia and bottled up the remaining white forces in the south. But the situation in Siberia and the Far East was far more chaotic and fluid than it was west of the Urals. Admiral Kolchak, the supreme leader of the White Movement, had been handed over to the Bolsheviks and killed in February. His successor was Cossack Ataman Grigory Semyonov, who did not get along with the peasant population, Bolshevik partisans, or the British, Japanese, and American troops in the region. So in this episode, we'll try to sort out what happened in Siberia exactly 100 years ago, in 1920. One of the most important political and military factors in the region were the armies of the foreign powers who had intervened in 1918. These forces were as diverse as they were lacking in coordination and common policy. In general, the British, Americans, and Japanese hoped to supply Kolchak's armies and support the whites, but they also justified their presence officially as a rescue mission to save the Czechoslovak Legion. The Legion was made up of former Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war, who'd organized themselves into a powerful armed force. At first, they fought alongside the Bolsheviks, but then became somewhat of a wild card factor, and by 1920, all they wanted to do was get back home. The Americans were also in Siberia to rescue the Czechs, in theory, but in practice were even less clear about their objectives than the British or the Japanese. They were there because of pressure from the British and French, anti-Bolshevism, and simply because the Japanese were there, though they sometimes ended up intervening to protect Russian civilians from the excesses of their white allies. The American commander, General Graves, did his best to keep his men out of any combat with the Red Army, and by and large he succeeded in this task. And it was the Japanese army that was the largest and most powerful force in Siberia. There were about 5,000 Poles, 6,500 British and Canadians, 9,000 Americans, 60,000 Czechoslovaks, and 70,000 Japanese, along with smaller numbers of French, Chinese, Italians, Serbs, and others. These forces were spread out over a vast area, mostly in towns along the railway. The Brits were west of Baikal, the Americans east of it along the railroad, and the Japanese were pretty much everywhere. The size of the Japanese force was actually 10 times larger than what had been initially agreed upon with the Allies for the Czech rescue mission. And that's because the Japanese had another, much grander motivation. In fact, at first Japan refused Allied requests to intervene, but then reconsidered, because the army saw the civil war in Russia and the power vacuum in Siberia as a unique geopolitical opportunity. Japan and Russia had been rivals in the Far East, and even fought a war in 1904-05. Japan had won that war, but now its military wanted to make Russia east of Lake Baikal into a semi-autonomous buffer state that would give Japan a free hand in Manchuria and Korea. The Japanese justified their large presence as helping Russia's Asiatic population resist Austro-German influence, by which they meant Bolshevism. In practice, they gave their support to Semyonov. Their troops occupied most major cities and towns east of Lake Baikal, and along with the Americans, guarded the all-important Trans-Siberian Railway. So there were all sorts of Allied troops in Siberia in 1919 and 1920, but coordination and trust were lacking, especially between the Americans and the Japanese. US authorities distrusted the Japanese, with whom they were strategic rivals in the Pacific, and they worried about the effects of too much Japanese influence in Russia. US intelligence officer First Lieutenant Justice Davidson reported on what he saw as Japanese intentions. It is apparent that the Japanese are trying to control all the newspapers from Vladivostok to Irkutsk. I would say that 2/3 of the newspapers in the district are financed by the Japanese for the purpose chiefly of spreading anti-American propaganda. All the newspapers of Chita are carrying on an anti-American propaganda campaign, and in most cases it is followed up by a long editorial about the assistance and goodwill of our friends from Japan. There were other opinions though, including Secretary of State Robert Lansing, who felt that the US shouldn't object to the size of the Japanese force if it helped prevent the spread of Bolshevism. There were some clashes between the foreign troops and the Reds, and even some with their supposed allies in the white camp as well, especially the Cossacks. But mostly there was tension, confusion, and mistrust. When the whites were defeated in the East in 1919, hope in a successful intervention was soon lost. British Major F.A. Flanagan described a typical scene at Krasnoyarsk. June 25, 1919. Usual number of beggars, filth, aimlessness. Typhus prevalent. Some cholera. Also trachoma, which causes blindness. Large number of posters on the railway station which read, "Krasnoyarsk hospitals are crowded with venereal patients, and no more patients of this kind will be admitted." A great many of the Russian troops moving west are well supplied with vodka. Nearly all British troops were evacuated by November 1919, but a small British military mission stayed on until they received the order to leave in early 1920. Turned out that some of them could not outrun the advancing Bolsheviks, who took them prisoner. Major Leonard Vining wrote of the surprise of their capture. "We were having supper about this time when a soldier with a large red cockade in his fur cap came into our carriage and asked us who we were. We replied that we were members of the British mission. In a flash, we saw that we were captured by the Reds." Thankfully for the members of the mission, they were released in October. After the British withdrawal, it was even more clear to the Americans that they wouldn't remain in Siberia for long. Wilson hesitated though until the final defeat of Kolchak forced his hand. He then made a decision to withdraw American forces in January, but this was not known by the Japanese until it was publicly announced in February. The remaining white forces of Ataman Semyonov were not pleased with the US decision, and clashes occurred. Even US Consul Harris's train was fired upon by the whites, with the result that Japanese and American forces disarmed white troops in the area until the American withdrawal could be completed. On April 1, 1920, the last American troops departed Vladivostok for home. The evacuation of the Americans left only the Japanese and the Czechs as major foreign forces in the East, which is ironic, considering the Japanese were the most reluctant of the three Allied powers to help the Czechoslovaks in the first place. When the Kolchak regime collapsed, the Czechs were in a tough situation. They'd started the war in 1914 as Habsburg conscripts, become prisoners of war, cooperated with the Reds in the revolution, then supported the whites, but now they were just trying to get home. They prioritized precious rolling stock and train departures for themselves, at the expense of the whites, which put them at odds with Semyonov and the remaining white officers. Dutch war correspondent Louis Grondeis summed up the mess. The relative positions of the Russians and the Czechoslovaks resembled two drowning men, both scrambling to get onto a plank which could bear the weight of only one man. The Legion also struck a bargain with the advancing Red Army, which created a neutral zone between the two as the Reds followed the Czechs eastwards along the railroad. In March 1920, the Legion left Irkutsk, but were held up by opposition from Semyonov and the Japanese, who didn't want the Legion stopping in at Chita, Semyonov's capital. Eventually, an agreement was reached and the legion moved through, reached Vladivostok, and began its long journey home in September, along with 1,600 Russian wives. Over 4,000 Czechoslovak legionnaires had died during their Russian odyssey. Now, only the Japanese remained. Not all favored the policy of a Siberian buffer state, but the military was firmly behind it. Ironically, the Americans leaving unilaterally meant that the Army's argument for staying to prevent chaos which might threaten Japanese interests was strengthened. But the government, especially Army Minister Tanaka Gichi and Prime Minister Hara Takashi, insisted on reducing Japan's role. They wanted to concentrate on the Primorye region closer to home and get out of the troublesome Transbaikal area. This vast region east of Lake Baikal was strategically important, since the so-called Chita plug controlled communication between Western Siberia and European Russia and the Far East. And in 1920, it had become the front line in the Civil War. The new Japanese policy was announced on March 31, 1920. They still paid lip service to the Czechoslovak rescue mission, but they also left themselves quite a bit of leeway. We sincerely declare that once the situation in Siberia has stabilized, the threat to Korea and Manchuria has passed, the lives and property of our resident nationals been assured, freedom of transportation guaranteed, and the Czech forces entirely withdrawn, we will seek to rapidly withdraw our forces. Russian partisans handed the Japanese army an excuse to extend the occupation when they massacred the Japanese garrison and Japanese civilians in Nikolaevsk in May 1920. Japanese troops even occupied the northern half of Sakhalin Island in the Pacific in response. Eventually, the government pressured the army to withdraw its units further east, which occurred gradually in the summer and fall, and with grave consequences for the whites, as we will soon find out. So by fall 1920, the Brits and Americans were long gone, and even the Japanese had rethought the extent of their involvement and pulled out of the Transbaikal region to concentrate on parts of Russia closer to home. This caused a massive shift in the local balance of power between the Reds and various white forces, which had already been a mess since Kolchak's defeat. Once Kolchak was dead, white leadership fell to Semyonov, who depended on Japanese support for loose control over the Transbaikal region from his capital at Chita. But his grip was tenuous, as Bolshevik partisans limited his control to the areas around the cities, and the Japanese, Americans, and Czechs limited his control of the railway to when they saw fit. Semyonov also had a difficult relationship with the officers in charge of the remnants of Kolchak's army, who felt that he had failed to show enough fighting spirit against the Reds and failed to help them during the Great Ice March retreat of the previous year. Semyonov returned the favor and accused the other white generals of not fighting hard enough. And the Anglo-Americans also thoroughly disliked Semyonov because of his harsh treatment of the local population and his unconvincing commitment to democracy. Given his weak position following the white defeats in the east, Semyonov decided to abandon Western Transbaikalia. He moved his optimistically named Far Eastern Army even farther east, behind the relative safety of the Yablanovi Mountains. This allowed the Bolsheviks to take Irkutsk in March, which had been abandoned by the Allies. But they were cautious, since the Polish-Soviet War had broken out in the west, and they needed to keep the east quiet to shift troops to fight against the Poles. At the same time, the situation in the Primorye region around Vladivostok was just as unstable. There was a weak Japanese-supported white administration in the city, but it was not supported by the other allies, and it could not govern effectively. Local socialist movements, including but not only the Bolsheviks, launched a coup in late January to take down the whites in Vladivostok. The coup was successful, which caused great resentment amongst the white officers towards the Allies, who they felt had not done enough to support them. White General Vasily Baldyrev confided his feelings to his diary. The bloodless coup was over by the morning of January 31st. It was the work of an international militia headed by the Americans. The militia escorted the Bolsheviks and partisan troops that entered the city and maintained order the whole time. So the coup had forced out the whites in Vladivostok, but the Bolsheviks were just one of several leftist groups involved, and just like in Transbaikalia, they had to be cautious for fear of American and Japanese reactions. So they allowed a local government, the Zemskaya Uprava, to take power. This so-called government of the land included several socialist groups as well as nationalists and constitutional Democrats. But the Bolsheviks were clear about their long-term goal. This is the foundation of our position, to not allow the Japanese to capture our land. And that will be possible if we give all authority to the Zemskaya Uprava of the Primorye region. We regard the final transfer of power to the Zemstva as a step towards Soviet rule. Another problem facing the Bolshevik leaders was that eastern Transbaikalia was still controlled by Semyonov and a Japanese garrison, and this cut them off from Vladivostok, which they could only reach through Mongolia and China. So instead of Sovietizing the territories that they'd brought under their influence, the Bolsheviks created a buffer state, the Far Eastern Republic, or DVR in Russian for short. This was a nominally independent state with its capital at Verkhny Udinsk, and was headed by Bolshevik Alexander Krasnoshokov. In April, the Reds began their attack against Semyonov. The Red Army advanced along the Chita River and made it into the city limits of Chita, but the whites and Japanese drove them back, and then stopped a second assault in May. This was a rare white success, and General Vladimir Kislitsyn recalled it fondly. All the Red Army soldiers who boldly marched on Chita are now seeking refuge in the woods. A commissar of one of the defeated regiments, who was unwilling to surrender, committed suicide with a razor. And this is when the Japanese and the Bolsheviks began to negotiate. The Japanese wanted to reduce their commitment in Transbaikalia, and so they agreed to recognize the DVR and withdraw their troops if the Bolsheviks agreed to a neutral zone between the Reds and Semyonov west of Chita. The Bolsheviks agreed to the neutral zone and promised not to implement communism in the DVR. This agreement led to the Japanese evacuating their troops eastwards, but gradually, from July to October. Now, Semyonov was left to face the Bolsheviks alone, and he knew the jig was up. To avoid violating the neutral zone, the Bolsheviks used partisan units to attack Semyonov through the neutral zone, and they attacked him as well in the east through the Amur front. On October 21st, the Ataman escaped to Mongolia in a plane, and the remaining white troops retreated to Mongolia on foot. The Japanese complained, but the Reds answered that partisans were not under their control. Chita was taken by the Reds on October 22nd and became the capital of the DVR on December 11th. Historian P.A. Novikov has remarked on this series of convoluted events. What is surprising is not that the whites were defeated, but that their regime was able to hold out for so long after the formation of the DVR. So by October 1920, the white presence in Siberia had been crushed, but the Japanese still remained around Vladivostok. The Bolsheviks now expected that the civil war in the east was all but over, but the peasants of the region would soon make their opposition felt. Up until the second half of 1920, most people living in Siberia had never experienced Bolshevik rule. After a few months of Red control, the peasants began to rise up against their new masters, just as the peasants did in the Ural and Volga regions further west. One of the reasons for this was because the Bolsheviks regarded Siberia as a source of food and manpower to replace the resources that they'd lost in devastated European Russia. Their policy in the region was to seize bread and nationalize industry. Following Lenin's signature of Decree number 171 on the taking of surplus bread in Siberia, they confiscated 45% of available bread, more than twice the amount that they took from the peasants in European Russia. There were also more relatively wealthy peasants in Siberia than in European Russia, and they were hit particularly hard by Bolshevik policies. And a Red report made no bones about the impact. The peasants' attitude towards us is unkind and even hostile. That's because we take everything from them and give them nothing. Conscription was another problem. In June, the Reds conscripted about 60,000 men, but the real problems began with a second round of conscription in September. That's when the peasants revolted in the regions of Tomsk, Omsk, and Semipalatinsk. The largest uprising in Siberia in 1920, though, was in Altai. And the revolt in northern Altai was led by anti-Bolshevik, anti-white, anarchist partisan G.F. Rogov. And we get a hint of his position in this declaration to the people. Not a single son to the soldiers, not a pound of bread to the spongers. Arm yourselves and see off the commissars who like to give orders. Take back our natural resources and live your life without the parasitic commissar nannies. Shout loudly, down with any power, no matter whose. Long live anarchy, mother of order. Rogov's rebellion lasted from May until September, but an even larger revolt of 10,000 men was led in southern Altai by I.D. Plotnikov. In fact, the Bolshevik authorities were so worried about Plotnikov's uprising that they brought in regular army, cavalry, and artillery units to deal with him. Plotnikov was no less opposed to the Reds than Rogov, as this declaration to the peasantry shows. The people of Siberia don't want a dictatorship. They don't want to be oppressed by a clique of usurpers. The communists in power are even harsher than Tsarist autocracy. They silenced free speech and reject individual liberties, freedom of the press, and freedom of thought. But this rebellion was also suppressed by October, for the time being. So 1920 had seen epic chaos in Russia's Far East. The British, Americans, and Czechoslovaks had left, but the Japanese still had a powerful presence on the Pacific. The Bolsheviks had crushed the last organized white resistance and had used the Red Terror and the Red Army to put down a peasant population that had not taken kindly to its first experience of communist rule. Although the whites would never return, Siberian peasants still resented Bolshevik rule, and 1921 would see the largest peasant revolt in the entire Civil War. So now that we've had a look at the unpredictable Siberian politics of 1920, it's time to take a look at the unpredictable YouTube algorithm, and I want to tell you a little bit about its impact on YouTube history creators like us. Our 18-part, 5-hour-long documentary series about the Battle of Berlin wouldn't be allowed on YouTube because it shows a part of our history that's not, how shall we say, advertising friendly. So together with other creator friends of ours, we teamed up to have a platform where creators don't have to worry about demonetization or YouTube's infamous algorithm. and where the subscribers are directly supporting the creators that they watch. The content is ad-free. For example, the Nebula version of this video doesn't feature this very ad that you are watching right now. And we want to thank Sofia Shirogorova for her help with this episode. As usual, you can find all the sources that we use for this episode in the video description below. And if you want to support our channel, you can do so on Patreon, and the link for that is in the video description as well. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1920, a production of Real-Time History, and the only YouTube history channel that is marching west and well supplied with vodka.